Okay. Okay, this is the 25th, I believe, 25th of November. This is Saturday. We're going to have our Schiller Institute, the LaRouche meeting here. My name is Brian Lance. We have a lot to report on, and I'll try to be very succinct starting out. And then we're going to move right into the economic miracle, or the methodology behind creating economic miracles. And we're going to look at China, and of course in the process of that we'll be kind of casting an eye back on ourselves, back on the United States, in the sense of how we need to move forward as well. But first I want to report on the International Conference of the Schiller Institute, which is occurring right now, the 25th and 26th, in Bad Soden, Germany. That's just northwest of Frankfurt, Germany. This is a major international conference, over 30 nations represented there, something 230, 240 people at last report. I'm just going to give just a sense in terms of the presenters at that event in this full two-day conference. It was led off by Helga LaRouche, the president of the Schiller Institute, following a performance, a choral instrumental performance of the classic Chinese song Jasmine Flower, which we know it was performed at our event by the Confucius Institute for us a week ago. This sounds like a much more polyphonic, developed version, and was very well received. Helga LaRouche was followed by Professor Hu Wenping, Director of the African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, a very prestigious institute, on African development as her subject matter. I think she went farther abroad than that, really taking in the world, from what I understand. She was followed by Dr. Saad Mohammed Mahmoud Al-Ghashi, the former transport minister of Egypt, on integrating the transport grid of Egypt with the Belt and Road, and really Africa with the Belt and Road, because obviously Egypt is the link. And he was followed by Marco Zanni, an Italian member of the European Parliament that's worked for us for years, spoke on the future for Europe after the Euro. More will follow. We'll have the afternoon session. Was led off by Hassan Askari from the Executive Intelligence Review, and he presented the outlines of the new Schiller Institute report on Southwest Asia and Africa, a vision for the economic renaissance. This was followed by greetings, video greetings from the Yemeni Office for Coordination with the BRICS, founded by Faoud Al-Ghafari, who spoke on LaRouche's ideas in Yemen. This was followed by a presentation by Mahreteb Hali, the Consul General of Ethiopia in Frankfurt, excuse my pronunciation. Mrs. Moni Abdullah followed, from the Egyptian firm Pyramids International on the Suez Canal expansion. Franco Percio Pachetto from the Bonafica, the company that's developing the Trans-Aqua plan for Trans-Aqua in Africa to refill Lake Chad. George Lombardi followed that. He's a former media social advisor to President Trump, who spoke on the real Trump, who he compared to Franklin Roosevelt. He in turn was followed by a statement from Roger Stone, praising the Schiller Institute's work on exposing the regime change coup underway in the United States against the president. So that's some highlights just from the first day of the conference, titled Fulfilling the Dream of Mankind. The Schiller Institute International Conference going on now today and tomorrow in Bad Soden, Germany. Now, just highlights. I mean, there's so much going on. It's tremendous. I mean, clearly the Trump Xi Jinping state meetings, the Asia trip overall, 12-day tour of President Trump to Asia has sparked a great deal, directly and indirectly, and fueled a process already well underway with the Belt and Road Initiative and so forth. But I'm just going to, for the sake of brevity here, just rattle off some of the key developments going on right now. First of all, relative to Syria, the Syrian opposition's High Negotiations Committee, which is the Saudi most recalcitrant Wahhabite grouping among the Syrian opposition, has itself now agreed to be part of negotiations without preconditions in Geneva. That'll be coming up on the 28th of November. So there'll be a 50-person delegation. This is a major shift. And the former hardliner of the High Negotiations Committee resigned earlier this week as part of the tumult going on within Saudi Arabia itself. Russia and Japan, the foreign ministers are meeting in Moscow. And the foreign minister of Japan, Taro Kono, said, "I'm sure about concluding the peace treaty. I'm confident that today's meeting served a step forward in this direction." They're planning for the upcoming visit of Putin and Abiy in a matter of the next month or two. The peace treaty he's referring to is that there's never been a peace treaty to end the World War II between Russia and Japan. And the settlement of the Kuril Islands, which is being settled by the joint development of the Kuril Islands by Russia and Japan, is allowing this process to go forward. It's also allowing coordination, including with China, South Korea, and the United States on solving the Korean Peninsula crisis. Skipping ahead here quickly, we have in Beijing the China, Latin America Investment Productivity Capacity Cooperation Conference, held November 22nd, with delegations from throughout Ibero-America and the Caribbean, including Jamaica, Uruguay, Chile, Mexico, and so on and so forth. Pro-Mexico, the government trade office, was represented by its executive, who praised the Belt and Road Initiative and increasing Mexico coordination with China, which is now moving ahead again. As you may know, the president of Panama has spent the last week in China. They've now established full diplomatic relations, and Panama is now becoming a hub for the Belt and Road into the Caribbean and Latin America. By way of backdrop, China is developing a Hungarian hub for trade with Europe. There's an ongoing exhibition center that's been set up in Budapest and logistics parks and so on, to coordinate further development of these rail corridors and manufacturing and other projects along these rail corridors from China all the way through Europe to London, to Hamburg, to Madrid, to Paris, and so on and so forth. The Austrian seminar on Eurasian economics held a debate on the Belt and Road Initiative in Austria, with top participation from the Austrian Chamber of Commerce, promoting the Belt and Road Initiative. And the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China has established a branch in Vienna. That's the largest bank in the world, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. They also, by the way, just opened up an office here in Houston, Texas. So that's just some highlights, just to run through them quickly. We're moving into a new paradigm. Very much what Helga led off with in her remarks at the conference in Germany, Bad Zoden. She quoted Leibniz, Wilhelm Leibniz: "We are living in the best of all possible worlds." One in which the challenge is to overcome great evil with even greater good. And that's clearly what we see underway. So I'm going to leave it at that and move on to the presentation, which we advertised, shall we say, for today, which is on the economic miracle of development and the principles of that. And we can go to the first slide, the Belt and Road Forum from this past May. Helga Zepp-LaRouche was a presenter at this summit. This was a international event. 35, I believe it was, leaders, presidents, prime ministers, hundreds of think tanks, and other organizations internationally participated in that. China has clearly emerged as a leading nation in the world. Others would say world power, and so on and so forth. All these are kind of ocean-laden words. The point is, China has emerged. If you go to the second slide, China is now, if you measure it in terms of purchasing power parity, that's one way of measuring GDP. It's a little more useful in some ways, although it's still limited by GDP as an underlying basis of figures. China is now the largest producing country in the world, larger than the United States. It has surpassed the United States. It's already, of course, the largest exporter. It's now the largest, has the largest economy in the world. So what is the method? Is it sustainable? And so to do that, we're going to utilize the methodology of Mr. LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche, economist and statesman, to look at China, to sketch out. This is going to be a sketch, but hopefully it'll intrigue you to think further on, not only about China, but about the United States, about the world. LaRouche's method of physical economy. So we'll go to the next slide. And much of this is found in So You Wish to Learn All About Economics, which is available, Amazon.com, inexpensive as a paperback and so forth, his textbook from a couple decades ago. And this should not seem as radical as you might think. LaRouche's economics was being studied by China, by Chinese scholars and officials going back to the 1980s. When they were attending forums that we held, seminars and so forth, in places like Washington, D.C. And of course, then later on, Helga Zepp-LaRouche has on many occasions been in and out of China, starting in the 1990s, the work on a new Silk Road, a Eurasian land bridge, these terms that we utilized in special reports at the time, came into circulation at the policy-making level in China. And behind this was the question of LaRouche's methodology. Among other things was LaRouche's prediction of the 2007-2008 financial crash, which Helga carried the message of warning to China shortly before that crash occurred. So we're going to look at this method, and then we're going to apply it. And I'll try to keep, again, this very succinct. This is also available for those here in the meeting. It's printed out so people can take and look at it more closely. The bar diagrams, somebody could hand those out to those who might want to use it. But I hope this is otherwise clear enough and clear enough to our audience at home. Okay, here, what are we looking at? Very briefly here. On the left hand, you see a set of bars running vertical. And this is the total workforce, the entire population of an economy. And this, we just think about it right now as being the world economy. Or you could take it as the economy of China or the economy of the United States. You have, in the center, you see an industrial label. This is your workforce. This is a portion of your workforce that's actually making the physical changes on nature. Again, we're not talking about dollars and cents here. We're talking about this vertical bar diagram on the left is representing 100% of the population, whatever that population is. And that population can be thought of as divided by inequalities, which separated into these three portions. So very briefly, industrial, and you see elder, mature, and youth. The mature is the portion that's currently at this moment producing output, making the change on nature for that society, for mankind more generally. Below that, you see agriculture, and the similar division. Of course, you have the elderly and the youth in both cases. And then above that, you have other, which is overhead, which we're going to just not spend a lot of time on here, even though it dominates in the U.S. economy at the moment. Now, on the right, you have the output of this, of your workforce, industrial workforce, and your agricultural workforce, your farmers, your ranchers, and so forth. And you see these divided into categories. You have the V. Their old terms go back to Ricardo. You find them in Karl Marx in another form. Henry Carey develops these concepts of well in his own way. The American system economist Henry Carey. V, variable capital, is that portion of the output that goes back to maintaining the entire workforce and their household, including the elderly and youth. The youth who will be the next generation in the workforce. Right? C is the portion of output, as you see there in terms of industrial output, that goes into maintaining the population of your workforce, but also a portion of that output goes to agriculture, right? As capital. That's your capital output of your industry. Physical goods, think of tractors, implements, and so on going to agriculture, but a portion is consumed also in the process of reproducing a market basket, household market basket that provides for the workforce of the industrial portion of your population. And then you have, after that, you have S, a surplus. If you've got an economy that's growing, you've got a surplus besides simply what's sustaining the existing population. You have a surplus, and a portion out of that surplus comes the portion that supports overhead. Which overhead, I mean, that's everything from doctors, lawyers, and Indians. I mean, that's the military and so on. I mean, it's not all waste, but it's also where the support of waste has to come from in a healthy economy. If you're sustaining your population, your working population sufficiently, not gouging it, the only other place that can sustain an overhead, doctors and nurses and hospitals and education and so forth, is in terms of the surplus generated by the production of the agro-industrial workforce to be utilized to sustain that portion of the population. Right? And of course, these interact. Right? The doctors, educators, and so on and so forth provide for the development of the workforce. After that is left over is S prime. As you see on the upper right-hand corner, surplus. That's S prime. That's after subtracting out for the overhead, the current overhead utilized in your society. That's the potential for growth. Now this is critical. Very briefly, critical. Is scientific and technological progress necessary? And this is the cornerstone of LaRouche's economics. Is that absolutely, and this is understood by various societies otherwise, that scientific and technological progress is absolutely critical. And that surplus, the generation of the surplus, the continuing surplus, is critical to the future existence of this society. Because of what? The most glaring sense of this is from the standpoint of finite resources. If we want to talk about there being limited, transition, we have an economics class series going on now. Jason and Jason Ross and Ben Denniston. It's on the LaRouche PAC website. It's on Wednesday nights. I really encourage people to follow that. That gets into these concepts in much more detail, and in a dialogue format, which you'll find very useful. If you haven't utilized it so far, you certainly should. But the transition. I mean, England basically virtually denuded itself of trees, before we developed coal, utilization of coal. And the utilization of coal, of course, went to steam power and so forth. The whole revolution occurred as a result. Likewise, there's only, relatively speaking, a certain amount of oil, natural gas, so on and so forth available. Some countries have more, some less, but the point is, mankind has continually been confronted with the fact that the sustaining of his population, mankind's population, requires revolutions in science and technology. And therefore, a growing division of labor, and therefore requires a growing population. That these are interconnected concepts. And so what we're looking at in terms of that prior diagram is really a set of inequalities. The left side is not equal to the right side. The left side, the population is producing an output which has to be more than it's consuming. The portion of the workforce engaged in agriculture actually has to be shrinking. The portion of the workforce engaged in actually maintaining the labor force of industry also has to be shrinking relative to C, that is capital investment, which has to be growing as a proportion of the totality, right? And S prime has to be growing relative to C plus B at an increasing rate over generations. Now, this is really at the heart of what China is doing. At the heart of what China is doing is this optimism and innovation that we see being expressed in every facet. So let's just move on to the next slide quickly. This is the process. You take current levels of development, driven by creative breakthroughs by individuals. Those discoveries of valid principles, are transformed into new designs of machine tools. On the other hand, those breakthroughs contribute to the development of education, classical meaning the discovery of principles, of society, developing culture based on the continued enrichment of principles. Music, the arts, science, and so on and so forth, which leads to the development of an increasingly productive workforce, right? At the same time, the machine tool designs turn into the productive outputs in terms of new infrastructure designs, productive processes, and so forth, labeled there. And so you have this development ongoing, right on through to further development of the productive creative powers of the population. So if we go to the next slide, now we'll get really into China. This is what President Xi Jinping was speaking of. Now think about this. You didn't hear this from Barack Obama. You certainly didn't hear it from George W. Bush, right? This is in 2016. Targets for China's innovation. Scientists should be allowed to freely explore and test the bold hypotheses they put forward. Leading scientists should be given more power and liberty to decide upon the direction of the research and general management of research funds and research. The president noted it is an inevitable choice for China to implement a strategy of innovation-driven development when the country is facing changes. If we fail to recognize changes, respond to changes, and innovatively seek changes, we could be thrown into an unfavorable situation and miss opportunities for development, or miss an entire era. So think about China in terms of its past. This is existential, right? They understand this in a profound way. The next slide, please. And this is what he brought up again, just in his remarks, his 3.5, 4 hour remarks, which which is unusual for him, to the Communist Party's Congress. 19th Party Congress had just occurred, reporting on a perspective. Think about it, a perspective for looking generations in the future. And I'm reminded of LaRouche's book, The Next 50 Years, right? This is this year, 2017. This is the 19th Party, from his speech to the 19th Party Congress. Just concluded a few weeks ago. From now to the year 2020 is the decisive period for fully achieving our goal of building up a moderately prosperous society. They're not saying they've got it. They're saying they're working on it. The CPC, the Chinese Communist Party, has drawn up a two-stage development plan for the period from 2020 to the middle of the 21st century to develop China into a great modern socialist country. In the first stage, from 2020 to 2035, the CPC will build on the foundation created by the moderate, prosperous society with a further 15 years of hard work to see that socialist modernization is basically realized. In the second stage, from 2035 to the middle of the 21st century, the CPC will, building on having basically achieved modernization, work hard for a further 15 years to develop China into a great modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful. So the point is not to dwell on socialism, this, that, or whatever. China is a civilizational state. We're talking about 5,000 years of history. This is another dynasty in that history. And this dynasty takes the form it takes at this time in terms of the Chinese Communist Party as its ruling political party, institution guiding the country. The point to focus on here is this forward-looking, really 50-plus year vision, which China's putting forward. And they're inviting other nations to join and collaborate with them in a bold perspective for mankind without adopting their model. A simple collaboration. Move on to the next thing. Okay, so just to give you a concrete sense of innovation, and we'll get back to some more later. This is patent applications in 2014. By rank. #1 country for patent applications. You get a patent on a discovery. It's led by China with 928,000 in 2014. #2 is the United States with 578,000. #3 is Japan with 325,989. And the fourth is South Korea with 210,000. This is an indicator that this is a crude indicator that China is innovating. It's not that they're talking about innovating, they're innovating. They're making breakthroughs. A patent application obviously doesn't give you a patent, that's an application. Nonetheless, China is a leading innovative nation. There's no question about it. Across virtually all fields. Well, you have I'm not an expert in this area. You have an international, this is some of these things that are settled, negotiated in time and so on and so forth. Who had the first patent? You get a patent in your country, there's a similar patent in another country, but there's a clearinghouse process by which these matters are resolved. So move on to the next. Okay, so energy flux density. We've talked about this process of economic progress as being necessary, very briefly. And we've looked at these bar diagrams. We talked about the shifts in the workforce that have to occur and have occurred. You can think about how society changed in the United States from largely agrarian to industrial and so forth. This is an example of the same process going on in China today. Energy flux density is a critical measurement of the progress in this process. The concentration of energy to be utilized per capita, per worker, if you will, and utilized otherwise in a given area of land per hectare per kilometer. The utilization of energy. Go on to the next. Energy flux density being the concentration of that energy. Think of a laser. It's concentrating in terms of an organized beam of light. Really a tiny fraction of the amount of the energy that goes into actually producing the laser. But as a result can do far more work, as in cutting, machine tool work and so forth. Okay, so let's look at some just rough aspects of it. China's energy consumption, just from 2009 to 2013. And you see this growth of, and this is terawatts of energy, from 2,500 terawatts of energy in 2008 up to about 4,000. This is the course of 5 years. Electricity consumption. And a growth in the use for residential services. Agriculture essentially may remain flat in terms of electrical consumption, but this growth in overall electrical consumption in China, and that means, we're producing our own electricity. We're not. Go on to the next. Here's the national grid plan by 2020. UHVAC corridors are ultra-high voltage system lines that minimize loss in transport. And this is the build out of the system, which is well underway, that will be completed by 2020, delivering a highly efficient energy, both DC and AC, for industrial and domestic purposes across the entire country. Again, I'm just trying to give you kind of a feel for this dramatic process. Next slide. And here's total energy consumption from 2001 to 2011. So you're talking about a 10-year period of energy consumption going from, well, shall we say, 35, 40 quadrillion British thermal units up to over 100 in a period of 10 years. That's total energy, all forms, coal, electricity, and so on and so forth. Enormous growth. Think of this as nuclear power. Yes, absolutely. So this is think of this from the standpoint of increasing energy throughput through the entire land area of China, and for utilization by the population and its workforce. Okay, let's move on to the next, if you can. I guess you're kind of juggling here. We have. Okay, you're okay. All right. So now here's manufacturing. And note that by 2012, China was the largest manufacturing nation in the world. It's moving its workforce, right, into increasingly productive modes of operation. The idea of pooling labor and so forth. This is long gone. So you see that from, if you look at it, in 2002, the United States was the #1 country, and it was in 1990. And behind it was Japan, if you look back down to #2, right? But now suddenly China is leapfrogged ahead, right, as the leading manufacturing nation of the world, with 22.4% of the manufacturing output of the world economy. I think that just speaks for itself. China, in terms of the structure of China, you have this SOEs, special, I always get this wrong, state-owned enterprise, SOEs. But there's two categories of this. There's about 50,000 of these owned by the central government, but then there's another 100,000 that were created by state government, provincial government. But the pillars of the economy in areas like electricity, advanced manufacturing, and so forth are concentrated in these SOEs in terms of major production capacity. Electricity, oil, natural gas, railways, civil aviation, military industry, These are big behemoth companies. And around us, it developed very rapidly a free market, right? Lots of new startup firms in a growing array of areas as the economies expanded and the government found its way since the reform and opening up that began in 1978 with Deng Xiaoping. So this process is being rapidly transformed. I'll just leave it at that. Move on to the next. Okay. Here's another example, and I'll come back to some other figures. This is the buildup of high-speed rail. You're already familiar with it. The U.S., all those red dots, that's all projected. There's nothing there, right? At this moment. There could be soon if we get Chinese and Japanese investments in the United States, which they want to make, either in form of loans or capitalization of a infrastructure bank. These are long-term proposed high-speed rail projects in the United States. You see the little triangle down there in terms of Texas, between Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio, up through Austin, and of course California. Imagine where the rest are from and to. On the right is the build-out of high-speed rail that's been going on. This map is already several years old, but this is what's been built out already as of 2015. Go on to the next. And this is what the railway map of China looks like as of 2016. I found one in 2017, but it didn't reprint fine enough to really put it up there. But it's even grown since then. I mean, noticeably grown. But note that the entire country, out into the most sparse areas, are now being reached with high-capacity rail. Look, green lines all the way out here to the west, right, are 296 kilometers per hour trains. Okay? And of course, the population is concentrated still on the eastern half of the country. I'll move on to the next. All of this is the building out. This is the energy density, right, across the entire land area of China. And this is the highway system. Highways and roads, major highways. Gridding China. It looks something like the United States, but nonetheless, this is what's been built out. Yes, so let me just mention over here. Let me just mention a few other examples. I want to get in terms of output. Electricity per capita. In 1978, it was 268 kilowatt hour per capita electricity available. In 2010, that's leaping ahead of almost 25 years, it was 3,145 kilowatt hours per capita. In 2015, it was 4,240 kilowatt hours per hour per capita. Right? So you can see you're talking about a 20-fold, maybe not quite, increase in electricity production per capita for the entire country. As a crude measure of energy density in terms of electricity. Steel, perhaps not surprisingly, 1978. This is the reform and opening up of Deng Xiaoping after the horrors of the Cultural Revolution. 33.24 kilograms per capita of crude steel. By 2010, it was 476, and by 2015, it was 586. Metal cutting machines. I don't figures weren't even available for 1978. These are from the National Bureau of Statistics China. You can access these on the internet. In 2010, metal cutting machine tools, 58.55 metal cutting machine tools. This is measured in 10,000 units of 10,000. So the total output of machine cutting tools was 58.55 times 10,000 in 2010. In 2015, it was 75.50 in 10,000 units. In other words, it increased by 50% in 5 years in terms of metal cutting machines. Agricultural machinery, I mean, it's, from 1978 to 2015, it's about a 15-fold increase, and so on and so forth. Now, robotics. China is now the largest market in the world for robotics. U.S., German, Taiwanese companies produce for export, major exports for robotics into China. By 2020, under the Vision 2020-2025 plan, action plan, Made in China plan, China wants to be producing 50% of all the robots that it utilizes. All right? So, I mean, I'm just trying to give you an idea. Computer-aided design software. The United States and China combined produce 45% of global R&D spending on computer-aided design software. For machine tool use, CAD use for machine tools, and so on and so forth. Between 2010 and 2015, China installed 90,000 robots, 1/3 of the world total. Compared to 80,000 in Asia, Europe, and the U.S. combined. Now, let me add here, this robots thing. I mean, there's a lot of fantasy around this robot. So I just want to put this in perspective a little bit. But if you think about with lasers, with the kind of capabilities we're developing, say, for example, that we know of in terms of astronomy, to see deep into space, you think about the ability to see deep into the small, the ability to utilize precision machinery to do things that are beyond the scope of what man can see or touch or direct himself personally, that they can be utilized, the utilization of science. I'll just leave it at that. That's the area in which robotics, whether it's in surgery and medicine in various areas, in terms of new metallurgy, new metalworking tools, and so forth. This is where robotics really begins to have a major role. It's not simply as a labor replacement, because in fact somebody's got to maintain the robots. Not just maintain them, but program them. And that means developing the software and so on and so forth, and upgrading. And so, this is not a simple process. So robots are not going to replace people, but it's part of the process of increasing the ability to apply work for man. This is a process that's underway, and China is there and planning to do a lot more. I mean, they're putting hundreds of billions of dollars right now into robotics, into developing robotics, and all that go into that and the work around it. And I would just add briefly that they do have a labor force problem. Their population, their labor force is dropping by 3 to 5 million people a year because of the aging of the population. People are leaving the workforce because of the one child per family policy, which has now been removed. There's 2 children per family, so forth. They'll probably end up having to think about that some more too. But the point is that they have a need to increase productivity and upgrade the productive capacities of their economy rapidly under these circumstances. So that's just a parenthetical note, if you will. Now let's go on to the next. I think it's probably more, well, we can skip over this presentation. But here, okay. I want to just get to a paradox here, which also gets us back to LaRouche's economics in a very succinct way. A paradox. It's a paradox in Western media thinking, which they can't solve. They think it's China's problem, but it's their problem. which is this is from a Heritage Foundation report. I saw a better one the other day, but I couldn't find it in time for this presentation. Consumption in China is falling. Look at this. From 2000 to 2010, this Heritage Foundation report is saying, oh, gee, and then it's increasing a bit. Well, this is a good sign. The other reports that I saw is an IMF report, and we'll come to another one, IMF report just in a second, is that China's long-term problem is that consumption is falling. Now, we're going to get into China's consumption in a second. But falling relative to what? China's consumption is falling relative to the size of the entire GDP. And again, GDP is a poor, massive data to work with. But nonetheless, as a proportion of total output, consumption is falling. So obviously, how can people that are consuming less and less consume more and more? I mean, that's one way of thinking about it. China has to increase its consumption level. They have to model themselves after the West. Notice how we've shifted to a service economy, right? And nobody does anything. Everybody sits around, and smokes pot and, or whatever, shovels paper and on and on. Anyway, this is kind of the rough idea. They're supposed to adopt to our society. And they're going to be pushed in this direction because this is only logical. Well, that's not, China doesn't have that understanding. Next slide. Okay. Oh, maybe I got them out of order. Go on to, there, okay. I'll have to come back. China consumes too little. Okay, this is the International Monetary Fund, right? World Economic Outlook, IMF staff estimates. China consumes too little because it has a high savings rate and low consumption. Okay, so this is another example of the same basic thing, and we'll come back to the savings rate in a minute as well. Okay, now, think back to LaRouche's economic model, as we were discussing it very briefly, the bar diagram. Have it there in front of you. I mentioned it briefly, S prime over C plus B. That for over time, for an economy, or for mankind, take it out of the dictator, for mankind as a whole, mankind's durable survival depends on him increasing the capital investment relative to what he requires to simply sustain his household from day to day and week to week. Farmer is not going to get more productive simply by working harder. He's got to develop tools or have access to tools, and he's got to advance those tools to make his farm more productive. And inputs and other forms, fertilizers. Industrially, the same kind of process. You not only have to compensate for wear and tear, right, for depreciation and the rest, but you've got to actually be advancing. So in both processes, over the entire agro-industrial process, you've got to have increasing ratios of C capital investment relative to B as a proportion. That doesn't mean standards of living are not rising, but as a proportion of the 100%, the ratio of B to C is shrinking, and the ratio of S prime to C plus B has got to be increased. That I can stop for a second here if there's a question. Sure. If you can jump forward a couple, I go back to Lens Bargrady. Our diagram. You're going back. Okay. Yeah. I just thought it would help if some people had that up in front of them.
And that was early.
Yeah, well, I've got it again there, so.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah. There. Okay. All right. The total output, let's just take industrial output. A portion of the industrial output, of the industrial work, goes to C, capital. That is the proportion that goes back into maintaining the productive capacity of your economy, of your industrial economy, right? You've got to replace what you use up, right? Another proportion of the output goes back into maintaining the population in terms of its, household market basket. The car the worker drives to work, the refrigerators, as well as the food and the clothing and all the rest, right? That's the V. That's variable. And these are old terminologies. It's not important, but it's a V. Okay? Now, over time, you've got to increase the capital intensity of your economy. So offset for marginal resources, increasing the resource base, transformation of economies to a higher productive level, and so forth. So C has to be increasing as a proportion relative to V. Yeah. Simultaneously, S, particularly S prime, after overhead costs, S prime has to be increasing relative to B and C. Think of that as S prime as what you have to go back into the next cycle, right? To accelerate the process of progress. Think of this over generations. Think of how the generation of a surplus, say for instance in agriculture, right, allowed for the development of industry. Right? And obviously it was a symbiotic relationship, right? The development of industry also then helped develop agriculture, the rest, fertilizer, and so forth. But this process of a surplus in agriculture allowing for the maintenance of a workforce, right, that could then produce in towns and cities, could run the foundries, could produce the implements, and so on and so forth. This was critical. Likewise, for the whole economy, growth of S prime as a portion of the total output is critical to continue that process. You need more doctors. You need more scientists. They're not directly productive. They're not making changes on nature. The industrial workforce is making the physical changes on nature. Scientists, engineers, they're passing those concepts, the new breakthroughs down right there, and then they're helping the educational process, the discovery principles, right? So what's going on with China? Well, V, as a proportion of total output, is shrinking. Yes, which is good, relative to their GDP, total output. Now, we'll go on, and I'll just show you very briefly. Okay, now you can go back to that. Anyway, you can go. Okay. We'll just leave it here for right now. And then we'll come to this remarkable figure, which Zhang Weiwei utilized. And I actually went back and found these figures. It was proof. Anyway, but that's all right. Okay, so what is China's consumer market value? What does it look like? Well, just to give you an idea, in terms of 100 households nationwide, okay, in terms of in 2015, out of 100 households, 89% had refrigerator freezers, 86% had washing machines, dryers, 119 out of 100 had a color TV. In other words, they had more than out of 100 households, they had 224 cell phones, mobile phones, right? 81% had air conditioning systems. 71% had water heaters. Only 22% had automobiles. 23% roughly. 42% had motorcycles. This is 2015. And of course, these figures had grown enormously from earlier years. 224. 100 households had 224 cell phones. So they had 2.24 cell phones per household. The average household in China is about 3.1. Right. And the average energy consumption per household between 1990 and 2014 tripled. And electricity, which obviously, you know, you gotta have electricity to run all this stuff, right? But that's just, yeah, right, just for the chargers, right? Education, the classroom size, the average across the whole country, this varies. All of this is broken down by province and so on. Go through numbers. Classroom size, elementary classroom size is 21 to 31 children on average in China. In regular senior secondary education, it's from 14 to 17 students per classroom across the whole country, not just some place. Yeah, what's called regular senior secondary education. Life expectancy at birth, in 1981 it was 67.77 years. In 2015 it's 76.34 years. Life expectancy at birth, yeah. Yeah, it was 67.77 years in 1981. And in 2015, it was 76.34 years. And the okay, household. Okay, this is a very interesting figure. I mean, it's completely contrary, I think, to most people imagine things are. Because in fact, for example, China's standard living, or per capita, this is per capita, not per house, per capita, is about $3,500 per capita. Okay. So a three-person household on average, $15,000, or no, $10,000, $11,000, right? Okay. Household net worth. This is from a study, and yes, that's the one. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, Marcia, thanks. Yeah, I only did up 8 of them because there's several pages, so people can kind of share them, look at them later. That'd be great. But this was a study done in China by the. It's called Investigation on China's Family Financial Report 2012, for studying current, by Southwestern University of Finance and Economics, China, in conjunction with Texas A&M University. All right. So in 2007, the USA average household income, this is prior to the crash, was $126,000 in terms of net household asset. That's, you know, adding up everything you own. How much is your household worth? Okay, on average, nationally, that was the figure. Post-crash, it had fallen to 93,000, and in 2010, it had fallen further to 77,300. That's a real measure of the economic recovery.
Wow.
Okay. China in 2010, and this was done on the basis of a survey process. The people went out, they talked to people, they gathered the data, and so on and so forth. 66,300. In terms of the difference between net household wealth in the United States and that in China is a difference of $10,000. That's the house. The house.
Cars, or not.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. All of that. All property. Cars, houses. You know, time and. I mean, I'm just saying. You know, whatever your total wealth. Total wealth. Yeah. Yes. That's a good point. Minus the debt, and that's very important to what you see in these figures that I just gave you. Um, see that in 2010, the first page, you open up the handout, China had already surpassed the U.S. in total household wealth. That because of its large population, that's not surprising. But if you go to the next page, you get components of total assets. And you see that China, the housing assets, a larger proportion of their actual total assets than in the United States. And the financial assets are virtually non-existent in China. Chinese people do not hold financial assets. No stocks and bonds, no junk bonds, no funny money, right? Well, that's true. Savings would be, well, no, that's not. Financial assets would not include savings. China has the highest savings rate in the world, over 30%. 30 to 50%. I don't know, but it's not. As I read these figures, maybe I'm somehow wrong. But the savings rate in China, as was referenced earlier in the IMF figures, saying that China has too high of a savings rate, and this is preventing it from consuming, is exactly why they actually own their property, their household, as opposed to being mortgaged to the help to have these superficial appearance of owning their home. China's parents lend the money, give the money to their children to buy houses because they expect to move in with their children when they get elderly. Right? They can take care of them for a bit longer, or help, right? Families and friends create networks to help support younger people getting their homes. So virtually no homes are bought in China based on mortgage. I mean, the percentage is very small, 10, 12, 15% of homes are financed through mortgages with banks, that kind of thing. And the savings rate is 30 to or more percent. That is, a young man or a young woman working even before marriage will begin saving at a 30 to 50% rate towards buying a house. Now the background, they don't really utilize credit cards. Not the same kind of, yeah. The debt is very low, extremely low, virtually non-existent in China in terms of a household debt, as Joel was pointing to. The background to the household question is that in 1998, I mean, most Americans don't know this, the Chinese government instituted a policy to privatize housing. And people were allowed, were offered the opportunity to buy the apartment. Most people live in apartments, right? To buy their apartment at a fraction of what the dwelling was worth, small amount. Secondly, because of the emphasis on the social aspects of running a company under Chinese law, Chinese companies were encouraged to create matching funds. Like with like we have with 401ks, right? Here in the United States, there, if you were saving for a house, your money would be matched into a fund by the owner of your company. That was another form of participation. And so as a result, China has a higher home ownership, home, not just house, but apartment, so forth, than the United States, percentage-wise. If you look at the last page that I handed out there that's stapled together, you see the home ownership rates there. Overall, 89.68%, urban 85.39, rural 92.60, and then by region. And then down below, you see the U.S. Ownership rate at the time that these figures were done. This was from the 2012 survey. Was 65%. Okay, so 89% as opposed to 65%. So the net household worth figure that you're looking at here substantially reflects the ownership of housing. And housing prices are going up in China, so that net worth is growing, but on paper. Yeah, absolutely. That's what's reflected in the refrigerator figures and the dishwashers and you couldn't run those things without electricity. Right. Is that 2.4 cell phones per household? Yes. Right. So the Feng-Wei Wei has presented this noted economist and really philosopher and so forth out of Geneva as well as out of Beijing. I think he's at Peking University now as well. At our conference in Germany, I believe it was in Berlin about 6 months ago, presented this. But anyway, this is from the study itself. So let's go on to the next one. Go on to anyway, that explains that. Here's just another figure: meat consumption. The rise of meat consumption in China from 1960 to 2012, just to give you an idea of what's. No, this is million tons. So it's just a gross figure, but just to give you an idea of some of the things that have been changing. Go on to the next. And this is only through 2008. This is the poverty reduction going on in China relative to the world, which is the top blue at that time, and in China versus the rest of the world. But virtually from the beginning of the 1980s, virtually all of the poverty reduction in the world was going on in China. And of course that's continued. So now over 700 million people have been lifted out of poverty. And when you look at the net household wealth, you see what that really means. It doesn't mean that China has this, we're now less poor than we were poor before. And so their poverty isn't the same as our poverty. I mean, there is a differential, but it's not as great as one, is led to believe by any means.
7 million lifted out of poverty.
700 million was in the last 30 years, 30 plus years. 700 million. Yeah. And this is the shift going on in terms of the Chinese population, in terms of urban versus rural, on out to 2050, a projection. But you can see they've already crossed, or basically are crossing the 50-50 mark. Have crossed by that by now. Just to give you a sense of the shift in the population that's going on. Again, reflecting LaRouche's underlying physical economy of LaRouche in terms of the shift from agriculture into industry. So we can move on from here. And so China's now moving out with this capability, this China model, if you will, to the rest of the world. But it's the LaRouche model. It's not a matter of socialism versus capitalism. It's a matter of physical economy, of principles of physical economy that are being applied. Let me just here, I think I can find it quickly. This is a paper by two Chinese scholars. Patient capital in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. This is from a few months ago. I'll just read here. And patient capital is the fact that Chinese banks, investors, and so forth are, in terms of investing into the Belt and Road, are willing to be patient, as opposed to impatient about a return on those investments. Right, and so they've coined this term "patient capital" to explain. Yeah, it translates, as an English language term, like win-win. They're right. Yes, that's right. Good point. So let me just read you here. The new structural economics, this is also the term that's really LaRouche's economics, starts with the observation that the nature of modern economic development is a process of continuous structural change, technologies and industry, which raises labor productivity and hard and soft infrastructure, which reduces transaction costs, making possible the continuous increase in per capita income in the economy. According to new structural economics, the most effective and sustainable way for a low-income country to develop is to jumpstart the process of structural reformation or transformation by developing sectors of its latent comparative advantages, which in the country has low factor costs of production determined by its endowment structure, but high transaction costs due to inadequate hard and soft infrastructure. The government can help transform the sectors with latent comparative advantages into the nation's competitive advantages by reducing transaction costs in special economic zones, industrial parks, good infrastructure, and an attractive business environment, and so on and so forth. And this is the way in which the Chinese scholars, Dustin Lin and Yan Wang, they're framing this outreach. I'm not saying it's perfect conceptually, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of how they're thinking about this themselves. In other words, you have human resources most profoundly from LaRouche's standpoint. You have natural resources, you have water, you have whatever, you have all kinds of things, but you don't have the connectivity, you don't have the infrastructure, right, to irrigate, you don't have the infrastructure to move goods to ports or to other parts of the country where they could be utilized and transformed as products, and so on and so forth. Bringing these inputs and putting them into place through the utilization of patient capital is how you do this. And this is what they're doing, which U.S. banks can't and won't touch. Go on to the next. So you have the unleashing of this kind of potential right in Africa. Go on to this. And this is China's latest, completely domestically produced high-speed rail system. And going back to LaRouche, the spiral up the cone of economic growth, and on to the next, and that's the most natural process in the world. That is growth. Self-similar spiral tonic growth. So I think we've covered a lot of ground. There's more that I have. And this is the growth of population over, hyperbolic growth, as with the world's population. Yeah, projection out to the future. So, in other words, if you put this on a cone, it would be like that Nautilus shot.
Can you talk more about
Again, I don't pretend to be an expert in very specific areas, but with that caveat, they begin with Mao. They begin with the new constitution in China in 1949, the Communist Party takeover of China, the ruling body, right, and the need to produce essential for the nation in terms of basic building blocks. Obviously, it depends along with everything else, but to increase agricultural production, that meant you needed iron, you needed foundries, you needed these things, and so that's the starting point. All the way along, there has been a policy which is often misrepresented, not that it was always perfectly carried out, but there was always a kind of underlying policy that the state-owned enterprises had a special responsibility to maintain employment levels, to protect the workforce. So even as the changes were being made, people had to be kept employed. I mean, this is the feature of it from a social standpoint, from the standpoint of social stability. And we're dealing with a country at that time of 500 million, something like that. I mean, it was an enormous process that had to be don't think about it from the standpoint of simply post-World War II. Think about it after 100 years of colonial destruction, plus the wars, Japan's war against China, then what we would call World War II, you know, and consequently, some 35 million people killed, and so forth. Anyway, that was the context in which, you know, state-directed. You know, the model then was the Soviet system of Russia. So, you know, it was planned economy, 5-year plans from the top down, and manpower was deployed, resources were deployed on the basis of a planned economy approach, which has since been turned inside out, I guess, in terms of the approach. But these special state-owned enterprises are still a critical pillar of the economy. But it's the total employment now is about 17 million. You know, out of a country of 1.4 billion, it's not, you know, it's not that big of a, not that big in terms of total, you know, the total employment, or even of the urban employment. But it is extremely important. But they've been, you know, there's been this ongoing effort, which is still ongoing. This is part of the continuing. The concept of reform and opening up is not something that's being shelved. Reform and opening up is the continual process in China. 25% of the housing that exists in China won't exist for 20 years. It'll be replaced. And that will then be, you know, then more will be. I mean, everything is being, you know, everything is being built and rebuilt as an ongoing process. And that I'm just expressing in another form the way in which we're approaching these state-owned enterprises. They're merging them, they're combining them, they're figuring out ways they're mixed. They're now becoming mixed ownership. That is, the government owns a percentage, but they're also a portion of them are privately owned, right, by other financial institutions or other companies, so forth, to introduce increased market features and management features from the West, for example, into how these companies are run. But still, throughout, the population has to be protected. No, that used to be the case, but in the course, they're very proud of the fact that over the course of, I think, roughly the last 20 years, I don't know, but in the course of roughly the last 20 years or so, they've now created a social security. It varies from province to province. You know, it's not all of the same quality, but it's getting, you know, and they have a, you know, a medical care system across the whole country. They have a higher number of hospital beds per capita than the United States. They need more doctors. They have fewer doctors, and we need more doctors too. But that's something they're working on. But those things have been become features of their society, or the you know, improvement. Mm-hmm. Well, what, the population is 7 billion now? Isn't that roughly the figure? 1.4 out of 7. So.
Traveling and I guess I keep thinking, I was thinking about a friend of mine who I think he taught in China, was talking about kind of lack of freedom of speech, where you have to be careful what you said to the students, that there was monitoring of that. I'm wondering, since now there's more travel back and forth, and you're saying that they're looking at principles that, you know, like the Hamiltonian, or is that changing their mindset in terms of clamping down on internet or whatever? I mean, I think that almost be impossible to clamp down. You know what I'm saying? So no, really, no. Do they ban? See, I don't think they ban Facebook. So maybe it is a bit.
Our internet trying to ban our too.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, I'm not saying we're any better. I think we're not so free, but I'm just, that's the funny thing.
Well, I think if you talk to Chinese students here, or Chinese, what you find is that they're much more confident of their own thinking, of their own methodology. That they know who they are. That they know who they are. Now, to the extent that, you know, when you're dealing with a country that's largely a peasant population, like the United States, you know, that are more subject to the whims and whatever of mob, gossip and mob effects, and so forth, then you've got a real problem when you're dealing with a large country, right? But China has, you know, a growing nation that's increasingly confident of itself and its own judgment. So they're loosening up, but not in the sense, I would add. I mean, this is just my sense of it, is not in the sense of going over to social media. They recognize social media as inherently a manipulative process, as opposed to a process of dialogue and deliberation. So, you know, the Chinese put a very high, I mean, I'm kind of citing Zhang Wei again, but they put a very high value on stability, right? A very high value on good governance, as opposed to democracy. They emphasize good governance. Now, what is a measure of good government? Is it democracy? Or more important, is it good governance? If you have a process politically, okay, in the United States we have two major parties. Each of them represents sectarian interests, you know, certain regional interests, certain urban versus rural interests, so on and so forth. Nobody represents the national. You know, one way of thinking about it is, I mean, there's 9 other parties, I guess, in China, but there's the one major party, the Chinese Communist Party, and it, you know, it runs the show, right? And consultation went increasingly with the other parties. But their point is, we take responsibility for the whole country for the next 100 years. You know, if we screw up, you know, it's on our shoulders, right? So it's so the question of good governance is not something, you know, phrase. They got to get it right. And the long haul view, the 35, 40, 50-year perspective, Xi Jinping, you know, put forward, not just as his personal opinion, but it was what they had decided upon as a political party, that this is their perspective now going forward. That's to meet this responsibility of good governance. So it's a different thinking, and Zhang Wei emphasizes the point that this goes back to the Yellow River and the Yangtze. You know, it goes back to the flooding of these rivers and the massive damage of these rivers that China has always dealt with from you know, the beginning of time, measurable time, that you had to have a national government. You had to have a central government to be able to control these large natural forces. And so the development of Chinese central government out of this, you know, dealing with these natural issues, so central just to the day-to-day lives of the people, you know, created this this civilizational system that's prevailed over 5,000 years, and that it's only taken another form with the Communist Party of China. It's a new ideological form. with the same responsibility. And you have these Confucian principles underlying all of it, right up through today. Mutual respect, and learning. 86% of the government people in government are from ordinary backgrounds. It's incredibly democratic in that, if you will, in that sense. It's not drawn from a ruling strata. This goes back to the old Confucian system of education. This educational system is open. It's open to everybody. Positions are open to anybody. You go through the exam system from local village up to this province, up to the federal level, and the best are chosen, to rule. So that's one of these undergirding kind of concepts, right? And the respect for work comes out of the country organized that way, with very high literacy. Yeah, that's really strange. Yeah, politicians are lawyers. Yeah, they're more likely engineers. I mean, they're more likely. That's the most common. They're typing-outs. Yeah. Yes.
Could you say more about Zhang Weiwei and how do you spell the name?
Zhang. And Weiwei is one word. Weiwei. First W is capitalized. The second one isn't. You can just Google it. You'll find links.
Can you share a little bit about? He's a professor and economist.
Yeah, no, I don't really know his full background. I mean, he's been all over the world. He's traveled extensively. Obviously, in part, he spoke to the Scheller Institute event in Berlin back maybe 6 months ago. Roughly.
Oh, we have a report, don't we? Did you read the report? You have no report?
He's the author of best-selling books.
Yeah, The China Wave.
Okay.
The book is available in English. Yeah, there's numbers of videos of his president. He's very. I mean, he's debated Paul Krugman. He's debated who's the guy, the end of liberal, end of Fukuyama. That's it, not Krugman. Fukuyama. He debated Fukuyama in history, neocon philosophers so-called. Go away.
Go away.
No, the artist? No way. No way. So anyway, he's out of the University of Geneva, but he's also, I think, simultaneously at a University of Peking. So he operates at a very high level as a consultant advisor, and obviously as a kind of dialogue partner, working east to west and west to east. Remarkable. And they're really worth watching his videos, because he, in these debates and so forth, he takes up, he'll take on all these questions with people coming from conservative, liberal, Western views and so forth, and answer them in his terms. He brags about China. He's not shy about bragging about China's accomplishments and being very upfront about how he thinks about it. Some other Chinese leaders don't. They'd rather. They're low key. They prefer a low key, not just personally, but they think he's a little too outspoken. But it's definitely very important for dialogue.
They still arrest people.
We don't hear.
I said China, yeah, we do arrest people for spies, but one of our best so-called spies
Well, I
there
missed
was
your
a
point.
woman in Houston, she was a member of the Sister City group, and she was arrested back in 2016.
She's still there, isn't she?
I don't know. Well, they, she was supposed to be released with properly speaking of
Deputy.
Have you looked into what it means when China says someone is no longer impoverished, and they're out of poverty? Is there some measure that they use to say that they're not in poverty? I mean, I have ideas what it would be, but I don't know if there's anything.
That's a good question. I couldn't answer it right now. I'm sure there is, but I think I tried to answer it in a different way by pointing to net household wealth.
Yeah. Well, my thinking would be that they would have a place to live, would have water, and have food. That would be sort of a measure of being out of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know that that's the case. That would be an assumption I would.
It makes sense. I'm sure it's not something just superficial. It probably is along those lines. I'm sorry, I just don't know the answer. I'm confident it's a good answer.
One thing that's really brought up, way in this whole method is the question of the people-to-people relations, and to really go after what you were saying, which you brought up at the very beginning of your session about how you have these American so-called economists or whatever, Western economists who say that China should model themselves on us. And there's a really interesting comparison where they're saying, well, look at New York, in New York, China way well, you can look at New York and look at the fact that, New York, the infrastructure is almost third world country level, because you think about the transportation, when you compare what you just saw with China and the rapid growing transportation to the United States. And it's it really shows, you can look at the United States and say, well, what is it that they're doing right in terms of how they're modeling their economy on the LaRouche model or the American system model, and what we're doing wrong. They really lay it out just in terms of very plainly. You can't tell us to model on the system of America that you've adopted today. We are modeling on the system of America, which is the system of the Hamiltonian model. And it makes that, I don't know if they say Hamilton right out, but they actually know the difference between that. So it's really very clear, and like you say, clear in their minds what they're doing, how they're going about shaping this economic system.
Yeah, Helga's pointed out that Friedrich List is the best, most well-read economist in China. Friedrich List, who was this List came to the United States and learned the American system, went back to Europe and developed the customs union, the German customs union, led to the unification of Germany, laid out the whole rail development program for Germany. He was a big promoter of the American system and used that term, the American system. He's the most, so he directly came out of the Hamilton school, Hamilton Perry school. And they do know the American system. They're a little more confusing about what's going on here now, but so are we. So are most Americans. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.